Uh-huh. Uh-huh. There is, huh? Huh. Big outcry over 18-year-olds being killed in the war. Well, yeah. So 18-year-olds are going to get more training. At least 6 months more training before going overseas. Okay. What about 19-year-olds? They don't say. Okay. Huh. May 18th, 1945. The war in Europe is over. The Axis there have surrendered and they're occupied. And a very, very big question on a lot of people's minds, people concerned with the weekly deaths of thousands and thousands of young men, is what will Japan do now? I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, there was active fighting on 5 fronts in China and the Pacific. In Okinawa, a Japanese counteroffensive failed. In China, a Chinese counterattack succeeded. On Tarakan, the Australians began their advance inland. On New Guinea, they finally took Wewak, and in the Philippines, the fight for the Ipo Dam began. The big news last week, though, well, the biggest news of the year so far, was the end of the war in Europe. Germany signed an unconditional surrender. 2 of them, in fact. There was still scattered fighting in a few places, like Czechoslovakia. Actually, there's still scattered fighting this week. See, since the German surrender, there's been a large mixed Axis force heading north through the Balkans to hopefully reach Austria and then surrender to the British, who they think will give them better treatment than the Soviets or Yugoslavians. Alexander Löhr, German commander OB Südost, all forces in southeastern Europe, and Ante Pavelic, dictator of the Croatian puppet state, gave orders before the surrender to those Axis forces in the Balkans to keep fighting their way to Austria. Now, Yugoslav commander Josip Tito did give assurances that any and all prisoners taken would be taken into custody, but that isn't what's happened. Some of his men have been executing Germans, Hungarians, and any suspected Serb, Croat, and Slovene collaborators that they've managed to catch. So the Axis forces heading north are not going down quietly. There are like 30,000 or so men of the Wehrmacht, the SS, the Serbian Volunteer Corps, the Croatian Armed Forces, the Montenegrin People's Army, the Slovene Home Guard, the Cossack Cavalry Corps, and their families in many cases, on the move. And early on the 14th, they hit Poljana, many having already tried breaking through at Klagenfurt. They smash into and through Poljana's defenses, and there is street fighting in the city, and small unit fighting in the local countryside all day and into the night. 20 British tanks arrive the morning of the 15th, and surrender negotiations begin. The Axis forces raise the white flag at 4 in the afternoon, but guess what? The British categorically refuse to accept their surrender, and they must instead surrender to the Yugoslav army. On top of that, over the next couple weeks, the British hand over tens of thousands more prisoners from the Balkans. And what happens to them, you can find out in depth on our War Against Humanity series. Well, you can find out more about this whole operation in general. In the 2 months leading up to the 15th, the Germans lost 99,900 men killed in action in Yugoslavia. For the Yugoslavs, Ljubljana and Zagreb weren't freed until the 8th. And these last few days, that still have seen heavy fighting post-surrender, loom very large in the minds of the locals. Sure, they celebrated the Soviet Victory Day last week on the 9th, with celebrations set up by the Communist Party. But I have a feeling that perhaps in the future, May 15th might at times rival May 9th as the Yugoslav Victory Day. We'll just have to wait and see. But the big question on a lot of minds is, with Germany out of the war, what will Japan do? What about the war in China and the war in the Pacific? When Germany surrendered unconditionally with effect from the 8th of May 1945, Japan issued an official declaration of its intent to continue the war regardless. The German ambassador was taken to task and told that his country had broken its December 1941 agreement not to make a separate peace. Not that people haven't thought of such a peace off and on this winter and spring. Back in January, Emperor Hirohito told Lord Kido, keeper of the Privy Seal, that he intended to talk to all the former prime ministers about the war situation in general, what with the relentless bombing of the home islands and losing Leyte and all. Kido, who already by then believed they should be trying to get some sort of peace settlement, suggested meeting them one at a time instead of all at once, so they could speak freely without worrying about Tojo, the warmonger, who was prime minister until last summer. This Hirohito did. Fumimaro Konoye tried to paint a realistic picture of the coming months of war, but it doesn't seem like he succeeded, since the emperor continued approving operational decisions and has been calling for counterattacks on Okinawa. When the Kuniaki Koiso cabinet resigned in early April and Kantaro Kangaroo Suzuki becomes prime minister, Shigenori Togo becomes foreign minister, as he once was in 1941 and 1942. He thinks Soviet mediation is all that can save Japan from unconditional surrender. And Shigeru Yoshida, friends with Konoye and former ambassador to the UK, wanted to meet with the British to discuss peace and tried to get hold of a plane or a submarine to do so. This not only failed, he was arrested April 15th and charged with spreading defeatist rumors. Well, long story short, for the time being, he's in jail and Japan shall continue the fight. The last 2 weeks, I talked about the recent Japanese counteroffensive on Okinawa, but there is a bit more to say. There were differences of opinion in Japanese command as to whether to go on the offensive at all. 32nd Army Chief of Staff Isamu Cho was the big proponent of the attack, one many times larger than even the April 12th offensive. As usual, Colonel Yahara took the other side of the argument. He was for continuing the defensive attrition tactics that had bled the American forces for 3 weeks. Yahara observed that the enemy advance toward Shuri had been held to a pace of about 100 meters per day. To send the Japanese troops out of their secure fortifications, to expose them to the enemy's vast array of artillery, naval firepower, and air power, would be reckless and would lead to certain defeat. But Cho's desire to seize the initiative resonated with the division and field commanders, who foresaw that Yahara's defensive tactics must lead eventually to total defeat. I mentioned Yahara's position already 2 weeks ago, but it bears repeating because he was very much in the right. The Japanese lost some 6,000 men and inflicted only 700 or so casualties, and 32nd Army Commander Mitsuru Ushijima has acknowledged Yahara's wisdom and will stick to defense on Okinawa from now on. But the damage to Japanese morale cannot be undone that easily. The Americans quickly tried to exploit their new advantage already last week. First with attacks by the 1st Marines against Hill 60, the 6th to the 9th, when they managed to take it for good. Then with attacks by the 5th Marines, which made good progress against Gaja Ridge, and then attacks by 77th Division down Route 5. The result of these being that by the end of last week on the 11th, U.S. 10th Army's line ran through Maida, Kochi, and Awacha, and the supply lines back towards the Hagushi beachhead were secure. Shuri Castle, of course, still lay ahead. A new offensive began that day by the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions in the west and the 77th and 96th Infantry Divisions in the center and the east, backed by 7th Division in reserve. This opened the most intense and desperate phase of ground combat on this or any other island of the Pacific War. The soldiers and Marines advanced against well-fortified Japanese positions in nondescript and previously nameless hills and ridges. The opposing armies advanced and retreated, attacking and counterattacking, surging up and down slopes, over tank traps and minefields, into the teeth of machine gun fire, seizing summits and then being driven back, until the Japanese and American dead accumulated on the ground, scattered promiscuously together. The attacks are mainly frontal attacks, and despite withering enemy fire that just wrecks the American armor, the orders are to break the defenses and break them quickly. So tactical innovation really becomes the order of the day. For example, the Japanese are dug in on reverse slopes, but accurate mortar barrages combined with faked ground attacks bring the Japanese out from their underground positions just when the mortars hit, killing many of them and forcing the others to withdraw. Well, the fighting and the micro-advances continue all week. 77th Division has captured Ishimi Ridge, so they're due north of Shuri Castle. 96 is on their left, and 1st Marine Division on their right. Just east of Ishimi Ridge is a hill called Flat Top Hill, and 700 meters north of that is a position called Chocolate Drop. This is a dangerous position to attack, complete with minefield. They advance slowly all week, but by week's end, Flat Top Hill and Chocolate Drop are still in Japanese hands. Now, Mark Mitscher's Task Force 58 has been patrolling the seas east of Okinawa pretty much constantly. He's wanting to be released from protecting the amphibious fleet and the men on the island since late April, but Army and Marine air units are still not yet able to relieve him. Airfield development on Okinawa is way behind schedule, partly since the ground is wet and soft and the spring rains have only made that worse. And also, there aren't any good local sources of coral rock to pave them. Individual task groups were diverted north repeatedly to raid Kyushu, but the bulk of Task Force 58 remained pinned to the beachhead, with its mobility sharply restricted. The daily pattern became predictable, and predictability was dangerous. Mitscher grumbled that his task force had become a high-speed stationary target for the Japanese Air Force. Around now, especially about the Kikusui campaign, the huge kamikaze offensive the Japanese have been running since early April comes out or has just come out. It goes chronologically into the details of that campaign that I haven't had time to cover here, what with the war in Europe and Burma reaching its climax. But there is still stuff that I do need to cover here anyhow. The Japanese send out recon planes by night and attack planes by day. Most of these are intercepted and shot down way before they can get close to the ships, but many individuals do make it through to make attack runs on the carriers. On the morning of May 11th, the last day of last week, 2 Zeros did just that, using low-ceiling cloud cover to both strike Mitscher's flagship Bunker Hill before the gunners could get them. One came in shallow and dropped its 250-kilo bomb just before hitting the flight deck and into 34 fully fueled Hellcats. The bomb went through 3 decks and then out the hull before exploding. The second plane came in almost vertically and right through the flight deck. Explosions and fires were set off everywhere. It took 8 hours to put out the flames. 389 men were killed and 264 wounded. Mitscher himself survived, but 3 of his staff officers didn't. The ship's engine room is mostly okay though, so this week begins with burials of the dead at sea, and the ships return to base at Ulithi Atoll for patching up before heading back to the States. Mitscher transfers his flag to Carrier Enterprise, which is then hit the 14th by another kamikaze, and the flag is then transferred to Carrier Randolph. Fleet Commander Ray Spruance sees kamikaze action as well, as his flagship New Mexico is hit the 12th off Hagushi Anchorage, killing or wounded 177 men. There's actually Japanese surface ship action this week too. Japanese cruiser Haguro, backed by a destroyer, tries to reach the Nicobar Islands with supplies for the garrison there. Both British escort carrier and battleship forces try to intercept, but it is a 5-strong destroyer force that does so, and sinks Haguro with torpedoes from all directions. This might well be the last surface action of the war involving major warships. But there is still plenty of war on land to come. I briefly mentioned the fight for Ipo Dam on Luzon in the Philippines last week, and that I would come back and talk about it this week, so now I will. Okay. The attacks against the Japanese Shimbu group in the region have been slow and costly throughout April and May, and there seemed to be a new phase to the battle, to take Wawa Dam. But that's suddenly not true, as 6th Army Commander Walter Kruger tells Area Commander Douglas MacArthur. The Manila water shortage worsened to the point that MacArthur told Kruger that the city, in addition to needing drinking water, was in danger of an enteric epidemic caused by the lack of water pressure to remove sewage. He wished to know when the reservoir in the vicinity of Marikina would be seized. Kruger, who by now understood the water delivery system, explained that the Wawa Dam The only fixture near Marikina was no longer connected to the Manila water system, and hence wouldn't alleviate the city's water problems. So the Ipo Dam, currently held by the Japanese, would be the only objective. So 43rd Division was sent north to fight what's left of the Shimbo Group and take Ipo Dam. Heinrichs and Galicio give a good basic description of the area near the dam. The battlefield is the area bordered in the east by the mountains, and in the west by the hills running along the Central Valley. The runoff from the mountain heights flows into the Argat River, which twists and turns down to the Central Valley. But there's an aqueduct that diverts some of it towards the Novaliches Reservoir near Manila. There's a road south of the river that leads from the valley roads to the Ipo Dam. The western part of this road passes ridges and caves, and that is where the main Japanese defenses are, expecting an attack from the west. However, Leonard Wing, commanding 43rd Division, is well aware that time is of the essence to solve the Manila water crisis. So his plan is to have 169th Regiment attack the main enemy line to hold it in place, while 103rd and 172nd Regiments swing east and then north around it. A 4th Regiment attached to 43rd Division, a Filipino one called the Marking Regiment, is to go all the way around to the southeast and head for Ipo from behind. On May 6, the first three all attacked at 10 p.m., and the plan worked pretty well. By the end of last week, 103rd and 172nd had pushed east and north to where they were like 3 kilometers from the dam to the south, and the Marking Regiment was closing in from the north. That day, it tried and failed to break through the defenses 3 times. But on the 12th, as this week begins, they succeed, and by the 13th have taken a hilltop overlooking the dam. But reaching the dam and eliminating the enemy are 2 different things. And this week, 103rd and 172nd are both pretty heavily engaged with the Japanese near the dam. The rainy season has also begun, and that complicates everything. What to do? If rainstorms were a disadvantage, artillery and air power were certainly a boon. Initially, tactical aircraft from the many Luzon airfields close by eliminated enemy anti-aircraft guns so that Cub spotter planes could direct massed artillery fire. In their 2 major barrages, the guns used 9,720 rounds. In airstrikes, 185 planes dropped 50,000 gallons of napalm on May 16th, and 240 planes dropped 62,500 gallons on May 17th, all creating horrific infernos. On the 17th, 169th push east up the road and link up with 172nd. They clear the road, but the Japanese are in retreat. However, that same day, 103rd and the Marking Regiment meet at the dam itself, and the Japanese have been caught in a double envelopment. The Japanese lose 2,000 men killed and 40 prisoners of war lost. Filipino and American casualties are 590. The surviving soldiers of the Shimbo Group pull back into the mountains and are no longer any kind of threat. As for the fight against the Shobu Group further north, on May 13th, Charles Mullen's 25th Division captures the Balete Pass and heads through it to Santa Fe, which they will take in a week or so, and the Villa Verde Trail. The 25th and 32nd Divisions have taken really heavy casualties just to take Santa Fe and Imugan. But if any of them think the fight in the Philippines is over after that, they are very much mistaken. Kruger wants to destroy any capability Tomoyuki Yamashita's Shobu Group has of counterattacking. But it's retreated into the mountains, so soon enough, 6th Army will push forward. And a few hundred kilometers to the southwest on Tarakan Island, the Australian pioneers that were stopped east of Tarakan Town last week push forward this week and reach the eastern coast of the island the 16th. The remainder of southern Tarakan is also secured with little resistance this week. Here's something to think about concerning the war in the Far East in general. The end of the war in Europe has all sorts of repercussions for all involved. But a big one for the Americans is which troops to send east to fight the Japanese and who gets to go home. One thing they absolutely want to avoid, whatever the system, is the long delays they had at the end of the Great War getting men moved around. They also don't want to discharge men by divisions because each one has new recruits and long-timers. And that would involve many short-term ones being released before many long-timers. And that is going to make a lot of people unhappy. U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall has movie director Frank Capra make a film called 2 Down and 1 to Go that goes over the newly designed system. It's a point system, and you get points for various services rendered up to May 12, 1945. This is your adjusted service rating. You get a point for each month of service, another point for each month overseas, points for medals for valor, battle stars, Purple Hearts give 5 points each, fathers get 12 points each for up to 3 kids. They decide it's 85 points for a discharge. So, as an example, let's say you join the Army in May 1942, right? You trained for a year at home until May 1943, 12 points. Then after that, until May 1944, you're training in England, 24 points. And you spent the war since D-Day in France and Germany, 24 more points. You fought in the Normandy campaign, the Ardennes, the Rhineland battles, and then in Central Europe. That's 4 battle stars for 20 more points. You got a Purple Heart when you were wounded once, 5 more points. That is 85 total points, so congratulations, you are qualified to be discharged. Maybe without that Purple Heart though, or only 3 campaigns, there would be plans to send you to fight the Japanese. There are lots of permutations with this system, and loads of categories for who stays where and who goes where, and George Marshall already in February calls the redeployment process the greatest administrative and logistical problem in the history of the world. People like Dwight Eisenhower make amendments like, if you've served in 2 theaters, say North Africa and Europe, then you're exempt from redeployment even if you don't have 85 points. Which means the War Department has to then find men from other sources like draftees to replace you. And what's the deal then with selective service? And how much training should you get at home? By early 1945, all of the divisions in the States have been sent overseas. So where and how are the new guys to be trained at the large unit level? There's also a big outcry this spring about 18-year-old soldiers being killed in action. And how much training do they actually get? Well, on April 25th, Congress passed an amendment to the Selective Service Act that stipulated at least 6 months of training for 18-year-olds. Against the pleas of Marshall and President Harry Truman, who think it will lead to disaster, to a dearth of replacement soldiers by 50,000 or more men. Truman then reluctantly signs a 1-year extension of the Selective Service Act with the amendment May 9th. There's a lot more at play, though, which I'll get to over the coming weeks. For this week of the war is over. A week that still sees a bit of fighting in Europe, but loads of fighting on Okinawa, advances on Tarakan, the taking of an important dam in the Philippines, kamikazes threatening the lives of senior figures in American command and taking the lives of hundreds of others, and the Japanese, well, Hirohito, planning to continue the war. Well, it might be yes and no about eventually advocating surrender. A lot of people have his ear. Konoye was the only former prime minister who had done a detailed study before meeting him, and in his view, the Soviet goal is spreading communism in Europe and Asia, and Japan starting conflicts like the Manchurian Incident or the War in the Pacific, and the Japanese extremist actions from the early 1930s on actually helps the USSR achieve its goal. And any future thoughts of settlement must keep this in mind. He thinks defeat is just plain inevitable, but gets the idea that though Japan will likely lose its foreign territory, the monarchy system would remain in place. Now, we know from the Yalta Conference that by secret agreement, the USSR will join the war against Japan within 3 months of the end of the war in Europe, so before mid-August. The US Joint Chiefs think the Pacific and China War as it is will last until around the end of 1946 or longer. So Soviet help shortening that seems worth all the territorial concessions made to Stalin at the conference to get his help. But that was a secret agreement. Japan's high command thinks they can count on the Soviets staying out of things until at least April 1946, when their neutrality pact with the USSR is to be renewed. Or rather, they thought that until April 5th, which is the day the Soviets said they would denounce the pact and not renew it. It's getting messy. Togo thinks that only Soviet mediation can save Japan from unconditional surrender. Harry Truman spoke on May 8th about the Japanese Army and Navy unconditionally surrendering, but that this does not mean anything like subservience or death for the Japanese people. So what sort of surrender does each player have in mind? And will Japan fight to the bitter end? And how many people will die from that? The tentative plan now is to invade Japan's home islands November 1st. But what's up with this new superweapon Truman just found out about? So many questions and so many wheels within wheels within wheels. Japanese politics are quite complicated as a general rule. We did a special a couple years ago about the structure of Japan's government during this war, and you can check that out right here. And our Time Ghost Army member of the week is James J. Bartholomew. That seems like a cowboy name, doesn't it? If I was a cowboy, I'd be called James, and the J would stand for nothing. It'd just be J. Jimmy J. Bartholomew. Sheriff James J. Bartholomew. It is the Army that allows us to do this series and all those specials and everything else we do. So join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned officers in our Army. Do not forget to subscribe either. See you next time.